soar the moment. Come to my hand. Help me find the greatest DJ. Level up Leroy!
Hey gang, what's up? It's Level Up Leroy here again. Hope you're all well, hope you're all keeping safe. Wanted to do another video. I want to keep this thing going. Last week I spoke about the DC Fandom event, how I felt it went, some of the reviews, and how it might affect Comic Cons in the future. If you do want to check that out, please check out the review. I'll pop a link up there. You can go back and see that. And today what I wanted to talk about was a book that changed the course of comic book history. Maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. I can leave that one for you guys to debate in the comments below. But I want to talk about a book by Fredric Wortham. It's called Seduction of the Innocent, and it gave birth to the Comics Code Authority ultimately. So as a Comic Con DJ, I've been fortunate enough to play across the whole of the UK, overseas in New York, Chicago, Cyprus, South Africa. It's been amazing. And a lot of these events, people will come up and they ask, well, how do you become a Comic Con DJ? And the answer is I'm just super passionate about it. I love comics, I love music, and I just put the two passions together. I love comics so much that I've always, over the years, been dipping into the history, reading books about comics, how they were so important in the Great Depression, reading about the Gold Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, taking it all the way through to the modern age. And I've even done an online course in comic book history because there was no university or anything like that I could actually physically go to. So I did an online course, passed, man, rocked it. And one of the things that you will always find when you come up and you look through comic book history is this one book, and it's called Seduction of the Innocent. Fredric Wortham, our author, was born in 1895 and he died in 1981. He was born to a Jewish family in Germany, studied in England, moved to America and settled in New York in 1932, where he held a senior staff position at the Bellevue Mental Hygiene Clinic. Now, it's there that he's working with convicted felons, examining them for psychological issues, and really delving into matters of the mind. He'd also written several studies that show how segregated schools were hurting children's mental health, and those studies were so influential that they were brought up in the Brown versus Board of Education court cases, which were heard back in 1946, and this helped end segregation in some American schools back then. So he's a good dude, right? I mean, he founded the Lafrague, I'm never quite sure, clinic in Harlem. It had multiracial staff and allowed kids from all backgrounds, gave them cheap and sometimes free psychiatric care. So this dude, he's like working with unstable patients, he's helping underprivileged kids, doesn't believe in segregation due to race and ethnicity. What happens? How does this guy become the most hated man in the comic book industry ever? And he's not just the most hated man. I would also say that he's one of the most influential men in comic book history. One of the most influential men who never wrote, drew, or published a comic book. How does that even happen, right? So we have to remember this is very much of the time. It's the 1940s, and America believes that it's having a problem with its delinquent youth. Kids are not listening to parents and authority figures. They're hanging around on street corners in gangs. And comics at the time is still a relatively new medium of entertainment. Now, Fredric is working with and analysing various troubled youths. And what he comes to realise is that all of these troubled youths, or 90% of them, have been reading comics of the crime or the horror variety. Now, this is the important bit. This is where Fredric really latches onto this bit of information. And I think this is where it goes horribly wrong for him. You have to remember, he's not grown up reading comic books as a kid. This is, again, a relatively new medium. And so he is seeing these kids. So in his mind, he's had no exposure to these comics. In his mind, the troubled youth of America is reading comics, and this is what is causing the issue. And again, what he doesn't realize is that 90% of the children in America are reading comics, whether they're good or bad. So He's taken this, he's got all these bad kids that he's been working with at the clinic, and in his mind, pretty much they've all had access to comics. Therefore, comics have to be the problem, right? And on May 29th, 1948, he produced an article called "The Comics Very Funny." It was a 5-page article that talked about the terrible things that some of the youths in the centre that he was working at did. Now, it is some pretty gruesome stuff, to be fair. It's an intriguing read, I'll give you that. I will attach a link in the description if you do want to go and check it out at some point. So, it's the late 40s. Parents are now freaking out about their kids not behaving at school, not behaving out and about, not listening to authority. And because a psychiatrist has said so, it's all comics' fault. Makes sense, right? And this led to, at the back end of like around 1948, there were bans being put on the sale of comics to under 18-year-olds because of the violence. The military banned comics being sold on their bases. And then there were even troops and collections where people were going around collecting any comics that showed violence or anything that was sexually suggestive and burning them. I mean, how many Action Comics #1 have we lost to this? Comics were in a dark place. And guess what? Fredric continued to add fuel to that fire when he wrote a book about the dangers of comics in 1954. This book, to comic book historians, is possibly the most important book ever written on the subject of comics. It changed the course of comic book history. It was called Seduction of the Innocent by Fredric Wortham. And he made this book by taking a look at some of the studies he had from talking to the youths in his centre. And his findings from these talks were that the comics promoted racial stereotypes, especially within Japanese nations where they were usually shown with yellow skin, fang-like buck teeth, and unrealistically squinty eyes. He claimed that comics were a bad influence on girls. Female heroes are always getting tied up or tortured in some way. The girls of the romance books were shown in a very bad representation of love and always seemed super dependent on the man. He found the way that women were drawn in some of the comics would cause sexual deviant behaviour in some of the boys. Some of the patients even collected pictures that illustrated women for their own, should we say, personal time. The ads in the comic books saying that people could remove their pimples, lose weight super quick, or the image of that bully on the beach and coming back and doing this and taking these pills and being super buff. So, kind of right, to be fair, has he got a point here, right? He's claiming all this stuff. He's on the side of feminism and he's against racism. Like, okay. But then he got it completely wrong with Superman, saying that he supports the Nazi ideology, claimed that Batman and Robin were a gay couple. And he came to this conclusion because one of his gay patients, who happened to be a young boy, said that one of his fantasies were he was either Batman or Robin in the relationship with the other. Fredric then went on to say that lack of pants on Robin's suit was also a giveaway of sexual perversion. And why wouldn't a fully grown man spend his time with a woman rather than a boy in the cave? This book did a lot of damage to the comic book industry. And it even went so far as to saying that it would cause asthma because kids were staying in reading instead of going out. I mean, come on, man. So, in trying to save comics from completely disappearing, the publishers got together. And what followed was a series of Senate hearings in which Fredric Wortham and his book, Seduction of the Innocent, were present. And they gave evidence and hit the various hearings. And what they did was they formed the Comics Code Authority, which is basically a self-censorship that the publishers would all adhere to, and it would prove later on to kind of nearly destroy comics forever. There was a point where DC Comics were seriously considering cancelling Batman, right? That's a thing. DC Comics were going to cancel Batman. Just get your mind around that. I will pick up on the Comics Code Authority, I think in another video. We'll go into that another time. So that is my take on Fredric Wortham and Seduction of the Innocent, one of the most important books in comic book history. And it bashes comic books. I mean, it's crazy, right? If you get the chance to ever read this, whether you can pick up a copy or whether you can read it in PDF format, I would highly recommend it. There's some pretty dated stuff in there. There's some stuff that kind of rings true at times as well. I'll say that as a comic book fan. It's a really interesting read and highly recommended. Thanks ever so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. If you want to find out a little bit more about me, of course, you can hit the links below in the description. And I don't know if you've caught it before. I just recently did a video on DC Comics Fandom event. I'll pop a link here. You can grab that. And don't forget as well, hit that subscribe button. Help me out. Give it a like. Give it some shares. I would appreciate it. You can catch me DJing over on Twitch. I've got my Facebook stuff going on as well and a bit on the Instagram. Come and get involved. Have a chat. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. I'd love to hear from you all. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you real soon. Bye.
Sword of Omens, come to my hand. Help me find the greatest DJ. Level up the roar!